Hi, I'm neutral. Rarely. What's the first video game you ever played? Wait, I should probably rephrase that. Here goes. What's your first recollection of ever playing a video game? Depending on how young you were, you might not even realize that you were playing a video game in the first place. You might have just been pressing buttons and watching the magic lightbox do its thing. The level of conscious interaction there might be debatable. But whatever the case, if the game captivated your short attention span long enough for you to form a memory of it, then I say it counts. Now, if you take into account childhood amnesia and memory fragmentation, I can probably remember things beginning from the early 1990s. Anything older than that is a collection of short flashbacks. This game, though, it came out in 1984. I wasn't even born yet. I live in Northern Europe, however, so there was a delay before consumer-grade PCs and their games started making their way over here. The game's called Xonix, made by Ilan Rob and Danny Kutz. Remember that memory fragmentation? I seem to recall that my cousin's family had a PC, and this game was set up for me, and I tried it for a little while. The time and place is shaky though, so the game may as well been running on our own PC. Still, I'm gonna say this was my first game. This game is actually a clone of another game, but I'll get to that in a bit, don't worry. What made finding this game extra hard was that my stupid brain kept mixing the name up with another 80s game, Xenon. And, well, I'm not gonna lie, this game looks cool, so I may have to revisit it later. Anyway, so this game is... Wait, what's the genre here? This game doesn't have an English Wikipedia page, but the page for Kix, the game it's based on, says it's a puzzle game. Okay, not my first guess. I'm gonna talk more about Kix in a bit. The Russian Wikipedia does have a page for Xonix though, and lists the genre as arcade. I mean, sure, Kix was originally a literal arcade game. DOS Games has neither Xonix or Kix, but it lists Kix, another similar variant, as a classic game. A bit ambiguous here maybe. That tells me the game is popular, but nothing concerning the actual mechanics. My Abandonware and Moby Games lists the genre as action. Yeah, finally. That makes more sense, doesn't it? So, a classic arcade action puzzle game. Okay. The idea in this game is that you have a black area called a sea, with a tiny sliver of teal bordering it called land. Your objective is to section off areas of sea with your cursor, which turns them into land. You win the level when you reach a certain percentage of landmass. There are these points bouncing around in the sea, and also a few moving around on land, and if your cursor or your trail hits any one of them, you lose a life. Lose enough lives and it's game over. There's also some kind of timer always ticking down, but you usually don't have much time to pay any real attention to it. I suspect that if the timer reaches 0, you lose a life as usual, because each time you get knocked out, the timer resets. There's not a whole lot to it, really. You move around with the arrow keys, there are no other controls. It's simple and sufficiently addictive due to how satisfying slicing off more land feels. And that's good enough for a game I may have played in the mid to late 80s. The sounds and color palette are extremely limited, and there's no music to speak of. The only thing you can really configure is the difficulty level, which seems to mostly affect the speed of the game and the amount of points you get. I'll be honest, I could barely handle the first difficulty level, let alone trying max difficulty. This is what max difficulty looks like. But see, was it always this difficult? I honestly had to manually reduce the CPU cycles so that I could have a slightly better game experience. At first I thought this was just DOSBox auto-tuning the game speed to whatever was close enough, meaning the game is way faster than it should have been, but I started second guessing myself. Maybe it always was this hard. We'll circle back to this later. I said that Xonix is based on another game, right? This is that game. Kicks. There is no story in Kicks. There's nothing in the manual. There are no developer interviews, no lore drops, no readme files. This is all you get. This moment frozen in terror. Black streets. People and animals running for their lives. A man either going in or coming out of the sewer. And look, there's our friend, Ramiel, the fifth angel. Here to bring about the second impact. Or that's the way I see it anyway. There's no story is the point. Kicks was made by husband and wife Randy Pfeiffer and Sandy Pfeiffer and published by Taito in 1981. It has a few improvements over Xonix, like music for example. Other stuff include varying level goals, more colors and graphics, score multipliers, and separate modes for 2-player and practice. This time, they call this freaky abstract creature wandering the playing field the Kicks. And the things wandering around the captured area are sparks, which this game will spawn more of if you're too slow. You still move around with the arrow keys as usually, but the controls start to feel a bit clunky. Especially when there are multiple sparks around to dodge. I guess that's because it runs much slower than Xonix by default, which is great, but it also feels harder to react to how the Kicks behaves. At least you don't immediately knock yourself out like in Xonix if you accidentally try and reverse your direction while capturing an area. For some reason, pressing space while capturing slows you down, like if you want to make your game harder. I didn't see much of a point to this feature. I had to research it online, and apparently you get more points while slow drawing this way. There's something that bothers me about this. Kicks came 3 years before Xonix, but the DOS port, which I'm playing right now, came out in 1989. 8 years after the arcade version and 5 years after Xonix. Obviously it's gonna have more features, right? Well, no. Not really. I'd have expected more over a 5-year gap compared to Xonix. I mean, Kicks 2 came out immediately the following year that the original Kicks came out. A year after that, no less than 3 clones came out. A year after that, another 3 clones came out, along with Xonix. So you'd kinda think that the basic stuff is all figured out at this point, right? More room to figure out different tweaks to the mechanics? No? Well, okay then. Because, again, the DOS port came out in 1989, right? You know what else came out in 1989? Volfied. designed by Fukio Mitsuji for Taito. The moment I saw the screenshots, I immediately knew I had to check this one out. I stumbled into this game through sheer blind luck, as I was going through all of these Kix variants. Compared to the DOS port of Kix, Volfied is pretty much a step up in all areas. You've got awesome graphics, colors, sound, music. Every level has different enemies that behave in slightly different ways. There are different power-ups to pick up that give you a temporary edge, sometimes a very crucial one like freezing time. And this time, you don't instantly die when your trail gets hit. Instead, it acts like a fuse where you have a little bit of time to get to safety before you get knocked out. You even have a story. It's not a very complex one, but it's there. In Volfied, you return to your home planet of the same name, in the spaceship Monatros. However, all you find are the ruins left behind by an alien invasion. You then detect an SOS signal coming from underground and decide to try and rescue your people. It's not much, but this already gets me in the mood to draw some boxes. Instead of Kix, each level has a different freaky giant alien that acts as the main threat. But really, all the little creatures that bounce around the playing field are the real threat in my opinion. There are no sparks or any critters wandering the outside though, so you're safe in that regard. But numerically, it feels like there are far more threats here than in Kix or Xonix. It's great. Kix and Xonix felt more like appetizers, but Volfied feels much more like a full game that you can really get into. There are only 15 to 16 levels, depending on what difficulty level you're playing on, but it's enough. It doesn't outstay its welcome. I just want to ask a quick question here. How are there so many of these games? I mean, just the Wikipedia page for Kix lists 18 game clones. There's an entire group on Moby Games titled Kix Variants. There are 82 games on this list. 82. What? And look! I found 3 games that aren't even on this list, totally by accident. I bet there's plenty more out there. I swear, you keep digging and digging, and instead of hitting the bottom, you just hit another layer. Another layer of Kix. It's Kix all the way down. Why are there so many of these? You know, I'm starting to think that in an alternate timeline, we're playing Kix instead of Tetris. And you know what's weird? Out of the Kix variants, there are 8 apparent Xonix clones. How do I know that? I mean, it's right there in the titles. There might be more. For an obscure game made by 2 people without a publisher, likely made as a side project, Xonix sure seems to have an outsized influence on the Kixverse. I'll bet this is because Xonix was the first Kix-like for DOS, right? And whoa! Would you look at that? Xonix 32, a 1997 remake of Xonix for Windows. It feels so smooth to play compared to OG Xonix. No DOSBox required. It runs natively on Windows 11 in a very, very small window. Seeing this makes me kinda nervous though. It makes me consider it was Xonix 32 that I had been playing all along. But it's 1997. That can't be right. Right? The time and place was shaky. No, false alarm. Ramiel wasn't part of the deal. I distinctly remember that the Xonix I was playing did not have this creature present. So I think we're in the clear. The timeline remains intact. Let's move on to another game that came out in '97. I saved the best for last. We're in the Windows era now. Boogaloopers was brought to us by Stickman Games. This time, the idea isn't to capture areas. Well, almost. Instead, you capture these critters, these boogas, by drawing a trail around them. A loop, if you will. You see, according to the story, if too many of these boogas collect in a void sector, they'll create a rift and cause a collapse. It's your job, as a sort of cosmic janitor, a Boogalooper, to prevent that from happening. The game is controlled entirely via mouse. You can trigger an emergency smart bomb by hitting space. That'll cost you 3 armor each time though, and you'll also lose armor by colliding with enemies and other hazards. Once your armor hits 0, your run is over. Mouse control feels much more dynamic and even liberating compared to the usual orthogonal keyboard movement. But when the difficulty ramps up, it also requires much more finesse. It's really easy to slam into multiple enemies and losing a ton of armor if you start panicking. Unlike in other previous games, enemies colliding with your trail won't cause you to lose armor or lives, but they will snap your trail and prevent you from closing a loop. The more critters you lasso at once, the bigger your score multiplier will be. For every 1000 points you score, you replenish 1 armor. The timer also encourages you to be as efficient as possible, because the extra time is added directly to your score. Like in Volfied, the level periodically spawns in different bonuses that you can loop, providing you with a few different effects. You can choose between 4 difficulty levels and 4 starting sectors. At every 10 sectors, you'll encounter a Booga Vortex. They're basically there to test your patience and finesse, and to give you a sense of progression. I think. The sounds and music are relatively minimal, but what little there is great. They give the game this weird, vague hip-hop vibe. There are even enemies that shoot bad music at you. For what it is, it's a great game, and I've always enjoyed playing it. Now, as is plainly evident from this highly accurate and detailed graph, the positives for each game increase in an almost linear fashion, in order of appearance. The graphics get more complex, the sound and music get a little bit more refined each time, and very gradual twists and tweaks are added to the gameplay. They're all fairly simple games. However, in addition to the control scheme, there's one thing that kinda stays the same. In Xonix, you capture areas. In Kix, you capture areas, with additional goals between levels. In Volfied, you capture areas, with varying enemies and power-ups. In Boogaloopers, you capture critters by capturing areas. In Boxer Rebellion, you capture predetermined areas. In Jezball, you section off areas in order to capture areas. In Xonix, you capture areas. In 3D. You know the drill by now. The mechanics, the main gameplay element, the core loop of these area capturing games largely stays the same. I mean, that's probably the point if we want to stay in the Kixverse. It's still as satisfying as ever to lasso areas to score points. As satisfying as it is to complete lines in Tetris or eating dots in Pac-Man, I suppose. It's a timeless gameplay loop. Speaking of timeless, what was your first game? Do you know of any games in the Kicksverse that I should definitely try out? Why is Boogaloopers not in the Kicks variants list? Let me know in the comments below. Also, this is my first video in this format. Any feedback is appreciated. Until next time, have a nice day.